There is a kind of invisibility that has nothing to do with magic. It is not conjured by spells or sealed by ancient hands. It is built slowly, over years, by the accumulated weight of people looking through you instead of at you, of your name being spoken in the same tone used for furniture and forgotten tools, of waking every morning in a place that would not notice if you simply ceased to exist. Lena Ashvale had lived inside that invisibility for 23 years. She had learned to wear it. Like a second skin, to move quietly through spaces that were not hers, to keep her eyes down and her breathing even and her hands always busy, because a servant with idle hands invited questions, and questions led to attention, and attention, in her experience, never led anywhere good. The Northern Servant Market opened at dawn and closed when the last transaction was recorded, which on most days meant early afternoon, because the traders were lazy and the buyers were wealthy enough to arrive late and leave early without consequence. Lena arrived before dawn. She always did. She was responsible for maintaining the archive room on the market's eastern wing, a narrow, low-ceilinged space that smelled permanently of mildew and old parchment, where records of every transaction conducted in the Northern Territory over the past 2 centuries were stored in varying states of decay. Most of the documents had not been touched in decades. Several had been eaten partially by insects. Whose species Lena had never been able to identify. A few, the oldest ones, the ones written in a script she had spent years teaching herself to read, were so fragile that she handled them only with cloth wrapped around her fingers, turning each page with the kind of attention a person might give to something genuinely sacred. No one had asked her to preserve them. No one had noticed that she did. She lit the small lamp she kept on the corner shelf and settled onto the low stool that served as her workstation, pulling the current document toward her with careful hands. It was a contract, or something that had once been a contract, written in the old tongue, the language of the primordials, the wolves who had existed before the current alpha bloodlines had been established, before the Great Council had restructured pack law and rewritten the terms of power, and declared, in official record, that the primordial line had died out naturally, peacefully, without conflict or contest. Lena. Had been reading documents like this one for 3 years. She had never said aloud what she suspected. She had simply kept reading, kept translating in the margins of her own memory, kept noting the discrepancies between what the official histories claimed and what the oldest texts actually said. Outside, the market was beginning to stir. She could hear the sound of boots on cobblestone, the low voices of the other servants preparing for the day's transactions, the occasional sharp command from one of the traders. None of it concerned her. She turned the page. The word she found in the next line made her stop breathing for a moment. Guardians. Not in the common usage, not the ceremonial title given to senior pack members who oversaw territorial borders. This was the old word, the one that appeared in only a handful of texts she had managed to find and read over 3 years of quiet, unauthorized research. This was the word that referred to something older than Alpha Kings, older than pack structures, older than the council that had made all the current rules. The primordial guardians. The wolves who had not simply led packs but had been bound to the land itself, to the deep memory of the territory, to a kind of power that the official histories described as extinct. Lena pressed her fingertip to the word without touching it, hovering just above the ink, and felt the same thing she always felt in these moments. A faint, answering warmth in the center of her palm. She had felt it the first time at the age of 12, when she had stumbled across a fragment of old text in the market's discarded refuse pile. She had felt it every time since. She had never told anyone. She did not intend to. The sound of the market bell announced the opening of the day's transactions. Lena wrapped the document in its cloth, placed it back in its designated space on the shelf, and rose from her stool. She had exactly 4 minutes to move from the archive room to the servant staging area. Where the market's registered servants were lined up each morning, in case any buyer required a domestic acquisition rather than a standard labor contract. Most mornings, no one wanted her. She was small and unremarkable looking, with dark eyes that stayed directed at the floor and hands that were ink-stained from the archive work, and her registration listed her skills as archival maintenance and basic document management, which were not skills that inspired competitive bidding. She took her place at the end of the line without looking up. The morning passed the way most mornings passed. 3 servants were contracted before midday. Lena stood. The sun moved. She thought about the document she had been reading, about the words she had found, about the careful pattern of language that surrounded it in the original text. If she was reading the grammar correctly, and she was fairly certain she was reading it correctly, the sentence was not a description of the Guardians as a historical category. It was a declaration. A living declaration, written in a tense that suggested present tense truth rather than historical record. The Guardians are, not the Guardians were. She was so deep inside the thought that she did not hear the gates open. She did not hear the collective shift in breathing that moved through the staging area like a wave. She did not hear the market trader's voice rise into the particular register he used only for buyers of significant status. She heard none of it. Until the silence became so complete and so different in quality from ordinary silence that it pulled her back into the present moment. And she looked up, and she saw him. He was not what she had expected an Alpha King to look like. She had seen Alpha Kings before, or images of them, the official portraits that hung in the council chambers when market servants were sometimes brought in to clean, all of them following the same visual grammar, broad and deliberately imposing, dressed in the formal sai. Layers of territorial authority, arranged to communicate dominance from the first moment of perception. Voss was not arranged. He was simply standing in the market gateway, as though he had arrived at a place of no particular significance, and was assessing it with the same calm attention he might give to a border inspection or a supply ledger. He was tall enough that the gateway frame cleared his head by less than a hand's width. His hair was dark. His eyes, when they moved across the staging area, were the color of deep winter sky just before snow, a gray so pale it read almost as light rather than color. He wore no formal layers. He wore dark traveling clothes that had clearly been used for actual travel. There was road dust on his boots. He looked at the line of servants with those pale eyes and said nothing for a long moment, and the market trader beside him was vibrating with visible anxiety, speaking low and fast about the available options, their skills, their contracts, their pricing, and Cale Voss was not listening to any of it. He was looking at the line. He was looking, Lena realized with a cold start of unease, in her direction. She dropped her gaze immediately. Her heart was doing something irregular. "The one at the end," Cale said. His voice was quiet. That was the thing she noticed first. Not its depth, though it was deep, but its quietness. He spoke the way a person spoke when they were entirely certain they would be heard. The market trader made a sound of barely concealed discomfort. "Your Majesty, that particular servant is primarily registered for archival work. Her valuation reflects the limited market demand for that skill set. If you are seeking domestic service, or a personal attendant, or something more suited to a royal household, I would strongly recommend." "What is her price?" Cale said. Not a question. "She is currently listed at 1 copper coin, Your Majesty. As I said, the valuation reflects 1 coin, Cale repeated, in the same quiet tone, and reached into his coat and produced, without looking, a single copper coin, which he placed on the trader's ledger table with a small, definitive sound. The silence that followed was of a different quality than the silence before. This one had weight in it. Lena could feel the eyes of every other servant in the line, every trader, every buyer present in the market that morning, moving to her, and then away, and then back again with the particular discomfort of people witnessing something they could not categorize. She was being purchased for 1 coin by the Alpha King of the entire Northern and Central Territories, a man whose signature on a trade agreement could redirect the economic flow of a province, who commanded the largest wolf army currently active on the continent, who had not visited the northern servant market in the 11 years since his coronation. For 1 coin. For her. She kept her eyes on the ground. She kept her breathing even. She reminded herself, quietly and firmly, that the invisibility she had cultivated for 23 years had not failed her yet, and that whatever reason the king had for this purchase, it almost certainly had nothing to do with anything she had been doing in the archive room, because no one had known she was doing anything in the archive room, and she had been very, very careful. She was, she told herself, going to be fine. The trader's assistant brought her contract to her for signing. Her hand was steady. She was always steady when she needed to be. She signed her name in the clean, careful script she had learned to write from the old texts, folded the copy she was given into her pocket, and walked across the staging area toward the Alpha King, who watched her approach with an expression that gave away precisely nothing. Up close, his eyes were even stranger. Not cold, which was what she had expected. Something else. Something that felt, in a way she had no language for yet, like recognition. "Do you read the old tongue?" he said, without preamble. She considered lying. She considered claiming a partial competency, a basic familiarity, something that would explain her presence in the archive room without revealing the depth of what she actually knew. She looked up at him, which was something she almost never did with anyone, and the thing in his eyes that felt like recognition did something else. Something that moved through her chest, like the warmth she felt in her palm. When she touched the old texts, and she decided, in that moment, against the lie. "Yes," she said. "I read it." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly. More like a confirmation. "Good," he said. "We leave in an hour." If you are already feeling the pull of this story, please consider hitting that like button right now and subscribing to the channel, because this is the kind of story that builds into something you will not want to miss a single chapter of. And we are just beginning. The journey from the northern servant market to the Voss Palace complex at the center of the Central Territory took 3 days by the fastest route, which was the route Kale's traveling party took. Lena had never left the Northern Territory before. She had never been more than 20 miles from the market in any direction. She sat in the enclosed section of the lead carriage, across from a senior palace official named Doran, who spent most of the journey managing correspondence and pretending she was not there, which suited her perfectly, because it gave her 3 days to watch the landscape change outside the window and think. She thought about the old tongue document she had not finished translating. She thought about the word guardians in the present tense. She thought about the fact that the Alpha King had come to a servant market in person, which no Alpha King did, and had bought an archival servant for the lowest possible price, which no one of his status did, and had specifically asked about her ability to read the old tongue before any other question, which meant he had known she could, which meant someone had told him, which meant her careful, quiet years of private research in the archive room had not been as invisible as she had believed. She did not allow herself to feel afraid. Fear was a luxury that required spare energy, and she had learned early to spend her energy only where it could do something useful. Instead, she filed the information in the organized mental architecture she had built over years of processing things she could not yet act on, and she watched the landscape, and she waited. The Voss Palace was larger than she had imagined it from the descriptions she had read in the historical documents, which was saying something because those descriptions had been written by people who used words with specific architectural meanings and had not been prone to exaggeration. It occupied the crown of a low hill at the territories. Geographic center, built in the old style. Stone over stone over stone, layer after layer of construction, added by each successive generation of the Voss bloodline over 4 centuries, so that the building had a kind of accumulated weight to it, a density of history, that Lena felt before she could see it clearly through the carriage window. She was given a room that was, by any standard she had previously experienced, extraordinary. She had lived in the servant quarters at the market for 23 years, in a narrow bunk space with a shared window and a storage chest that doubled as a seat. The room she was shown to in the Voss Palace had a bed large enough for 3 people, a writing desk with actual lamp oil already prepared, bookshelves that were not empty, and a window that looked east over the hill's slope toward the forest line, where the trees were the deep, still green of late season, and the light in the early evening came through them at an angle that made everything look like the kind of world that existed in stories. She sat on the edge of the bed and breathed for a moment. Then she got up and went to the bookshelf and started reading. By morning, she had identified 3 texts that contained passages in the old tongue, one that was almost entirely composed in it, and one that she was fairly certain had been deliberately misdated, its cover marked with a publication century that was at least 100 years later than the language and calligraphy style. suggested. She was sitting at the desk with the misdated text open in front of her, working through a particularly dense paragraph about territorial binding rights, when someone knocked at the door. She had been expecting a palace servant. She had not been expecting Cale Voss. He was dressed differently than he had been during the journey, still not in formal layers, still in the dark, practical clothing that seemed to be his default register, but cleaner, and he had clearly slept at some point. Which gave his face a fractionally less closed quality. He looked at her, and then at the open text on the desk, and something moved in his pale eyes. "You've been up all night," he said. "There are interesting things on your shelves," she said, which was the most honest response available to her, and therefore the one she gave. He came into the room without being invited, which was his prerogative given that it was his room in his palace, and looked at the text she had open. He stood close. Enough that she could see the shape of his jaw and the faint tension in his neck that suggested he was controlling something, some response or reaction, with deliberate effort. After a moment, he pulled the chair from the corner of the room, set it beside the desk at a distance that was neither intrusive nor dismissive, and sat down. "Tell me what it says," he said. She looked at the text, and then at him, and made another rapid calculation about truth versus strategic vagueness, and arrived at the same conclusion she had arrived at in the servant market. There was something in the way he asked that suggested he already knew more than he was indicating, and that pretending otherwise would not serve her. "It describes a binding," she said, "between a territory and a specific bloodline, not an alpha bloodline in the conventional sense. Older than that. The language distinguishes between the current alpha structures and what it calls the prior ordering, which I have been reading about in several texts from the Northern Archive, the primordials. The word landed in the room and did something. She felt it. She was not certain exactly what it did to him, but she felt the change in the quality of his stillness, the way a very contained person becomes more contained when something matters. "The primordial guardians," he said. "Yes." "And what does the binding describe?" She looked back at the text. She translated the next several lines in her head with the careful, exact methodology. She had developed over years, checking each word against her internal lexicon before committing to meaning, because the old tongue was precise in ways that modern language had largely abandoned, and imprecision in translation could completely reverse the sense of a passage. "It describes a mark," she said, "a physical mark carried by members of the guardian bloodline. It says the mark is not decorative or ceremonial. It is described as a living seal, an ongoing record of the bloodlines. Connection to the territory." She paused. "It says the mark cannot be faked and cannot be transferred, and will activate in the presence of genuine territorial need." She was looking at the text when she said this. She did not look at her left palm. She had spent 23 years not looking at her left palm in situations where someone might notice her doing it. "There is more," Cale said. Not a question. "There is always more in these texts," she said. "They are written in layers. The surface meaning is accessible to anyone who reads the old tongue. The deeper meaning requires familiarity with the specific rhetorical conventions of primordial writing, which are not documented in any currently available reference text." She stopped herself before she said the next part. Reconsidered. said it anyway. I have been reconstructing those conventions independently for 3 years. From fragments. Another silence, different from the others. No one taught you, Cale said. No one. Knew I was learning. He looked at her for a long moment. She made herself hold the look, which was not something she did easily with anyone, and especially not with someone who looked at her with that particular quality of attention, as though he was trying to read something in her face the way she read old text, carefully, without assumption, with the understanding that what was written on the surface was not the complete document. I need to show you something, he said. Please drop a comment. Below telling us what you think Cale is about to show her, because the community predictions for this part of the story have been incredible, and we want to hear yours before we go further. What he showed her was the lower archive, not the palace's formal library, which she had seen briefly when Doran had given her a cursory orientation tour, all tall shelves and catalogued collections organized by territory and century and subject. The lower archive was accessed through a door in the palace's oldest wing, a section that the current construction had been built around rather than replacing, and it required a key that Cale wore on a chain beneath his clothing, which he had not removed even during the journey. The door was old enough that the wood had hardened to something approaching stone, and the lock mechanism was not the standard design, but the older style, the kind Lena recognized from her reading as predating the council's restructuring by at least 2 centuries. Inside was the end. Smell she associated most strongly with the oldest documents. Stone-cold air, old paper, the particular mineral note of ink made from substances that were no longer commercially available, and shelves. Floor to ceiling, following the curve of the walls in what she now realized was a circular room, lined entirely with texts that she could identify, from 5 feet away and in low lamplight, as being composed in the old tongue. She stopped walking. She was not certain she was still breathing. Normally. How many? She said. I have not been able to count them, Cale said, with something in his voice that sounded almost like an apology. I can read enough of the old tongue to understand that they exist, and that they are important. I cannot read enough to understand what they say. She turned to look at him. He was watching her with that same quality of attention he had used at the desk. And something else now. Something that she might have called hope in another person, and was not. Certain what to call in someone like him. This is why you bought me, she said. Partly, he said, and the words sat between them with a weight that she chose for the moment not to examine. She turned back to the shelves and began to walk slowly along them, reading the spines and covers where they were legible, moving her lamplight in a careful arc. After approximately 20 seconds, she stopped at a particular text and stood very still. What is it? Cale said from behind her. This one, she said. Her voice was even. She was working to keep it even. This text is referenced in 3 of the documents I have read from the Northern Archive. The writers reference it as the source document for the binding contract between the Guardian bloodline and the Central Territory. She reached out and touched the spine with 2 careful fingers. The warmth in her palm ignited immediately, not the faint answering warmth she usually felt, but something stronger, something that moved up her arm and settled in her chest like a breath she had been holding for a very long time. It is described in those references as lost. It is not lost, Kyle said. It has been in this room for as long as my family has held this territory. Your family, she said, has been protecting it. Yes. She did not remove her hand from the spine. She was afraid, slightly, that if she did, the warmth would go away and she would lose something she had not known she needed until this moment. She made herself think, carefully, methodically, about what she was experiencing and what it meant and what to do with it. She had known since she was 12 years old that she carried something she could not name and had no framework for. She had spent 11 years building a partial framework from fragments and discarded documents and careful reconstruction of a dead rhetorical tradition. She was standing in a room full of the source texts that could complete the framework, and the man who had brought her here was. The Alpha King of the territory to which, according to everything she had read, the guardian bloodline was bound. She took her hand from the spine. She turned around. I need to read all of them, she said. I know, he said. It will take time. I know. And I will need to tell you things as I find them, whether or not they are things you want to hear, because I will not falsify a translation or soften a meaning for someone's convenience. Something happened in his expression. Something very small and very significant. I know, he said, for the third time, with a tone that suggested this was precisely what he had been hoping she would say. She nodded. She turned back to the shelves. She lifted the first text carefully from its place and carried it to the reading table in the center of the room. She began. If you are new to this channel and you just arrived at this moment, please subscribe right now, because you have stumbled into something extraordinary, and we are very glad you are. Here. The first 3 weeks in the lower archive taught Lena 3 things. The first was that the primordial texts were not organized in the way she would have organized them, which was to say chronologically and by subject, but in a system that appeared to follow an internal logic. She needed to read approximately 30 texts before she could begin to identify. The second was that the lower archive did not contain the history of the primordial guardians. It contained the guardians' own record. Of themselves, which was an entirely different category of document. The third thing she learned was that she was, according to every cross-reference source she had now encountered, the last living member of the Ashvale lineage, which had not died out naturally or peacefully, which had been systematically erased from official record by a council action taken 280 years ago, and which had, through a chain of undocumented succession that the guardians themselves had maintained. In these hidden texts, produced exactly one living descendant. Her. She sat with this information for a full hour before she did anything else. She sat with it in the way she had learned to sit with difficult things, without flinching away from it, without rushing toward conclusions, holding it steadily in the center of her attention and examining it from each available angle. She was the heir to a bloodline that the current ruling structures of the territory believed to be extinct. She was the carrier of a mark that the texts described as the physical manifestation of a guardian's bond to the land. She was the last name in a chain of succession that had been kept alive in secret, in this room, by the Voss family, for 280 years. She had been bought for 1 coin. She thought about that. She thought about it carefully. When Cale came to the lower archive that evening, as he did every evening, to find out what she had translated that day, she was waiting with the relevant text arranged in front of her in the order of cross-reference, which was the system she had developed for presenting complex findings clearly. He sat down across the table. He looked at her face. She had a feeling, increasingly, that he could read something in her face that most people could not, which she found simultaneously uncomfortable and less alarming than it should have been. "Tell me," he said. She told him. She did not soften it. She had said she would not, and she did not. She laid out the findings in the order she had established them, cross-referencing each claim with the specific text that supported it, walking him through the documentary chain as clearly and precisely as she would have presented any research finding. She told him about the council action. She told him about the systematic erasure. She told him about the chain of succession. She told him what the mark was and what the text said about its activation and what the binding contract between the guardian bloodline and the central territory described as the terms of that bond. She did not tell him about the warmth in her palm. Not yet. She was not certain she was ready to tell anyone that. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Cale was looking at the texts in front of her with the expression of a person who had suspected something for a long time and was now receiving confirmation that was simultaneously a relief and a weight. "You knew," she said. "Not all of it, but some of it." "My father told me," he said, "that there was a bloodline, that the archive was maintained for them, that someday someone might come who could read what we had been keeping." He looked at her. "He did not tell me it would be a servant from a market in the Northern Territory who was listed at 1 coin. He probably did not know the specific circumstances would be that particular," she said. Something moved in his expression that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. She had noticed. Over the past 3 weeks, that he had a range of expressions that existed below the threshold most people would register, very fine gradations of what in a different person might have been obvious emotion. She had become, somewhat to her own surprise, adept at reading them. "No," he said. "I do not think he anticipated the specific circumstances." "What did you think?" she said, "when you found out I was there, at the market?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the quietness of someone choosing whether to answer. The quietness of someone choosing which true thing to say. "I thought," he said carefully, "that the land had been patient, and that patience had a cost, and I was responsible for some of that cost, because I had the archive, and I could not read it, and I had been trying for 7 years to find someone who could, and every person I found was either not capable enough or not trustworthy enough, or both." He paused. When the report came that there was an archivist in the Northern market who had been independently teaching herself the old tongue from fragments, I came myself, because I was not willing to trust that to anyone else. She absorbed this. Who sent the report? A contact in the Northern Territory who monitors unusual archival activity. He said it without apology. "I have had people watching for signs of the bloodline for 11 years. Since your coronation. Since before that. Since my father told me the story." She thought about that. She thought about 11 years of someone looking for her, and 23 years of her being invisible, and the narrow, particular gap between those two things. She thought about the one coin. The price, she said. Was that deliberate? He met her eyes. I was not going to bid for you. I was not going to create a competition that might alert others to why you mattered. I needed the transaction to look like exactly what it appeared to be. An alpha king being casually contemptuous of a low-value servant. Yes, it worked, she said. Everyone will have assumed that is what it was. Yes. She looked at the texts in front of her. She thought about invisibility and the uses it had been put to, in her life and apparently in the long strategy of a bloodline's preservation. She thought about the way the warmth in her palm had felt when she touched the spine of the source document. She thought about the word guardians in the present tense, in a document she had found by accident in an archive one had paid attention to in decades. The binding contract, she said. It is not merely historical. No, he said. It describes an active relationship between the guardian bloodline and the territory, an ongoing responsibility. Yes. And the territory's alpha is described in the contract as the guardian's. She stopped herself. She went back to the text. She read the relevant passage again, slowly, making certain of the meaning. The old tongue word in question had no precise modern equivalent. It meant something between counterpart and charge and chosen witness, all three simultaneously, none of them fully. She had been thinking about it for 2 days and had not found a satisfactory translation. What does it say? Cale asked. I am still working on the translation of a specific term, she said. I will tell you when I am certain. He did not press her. She had noticed this about him. He did not press. He asked directly and without artifice, and then he waited, and he did not repeat himself or rephrase the question to create pressure. It was, she had come to understand, one of the ways he was unlike most people she had encountered in positions of authority, who tended to use questions as tools for managing other people's responses rather than as genuine requests for information. She appreciated it more than she was ready to say. For our listeners who have been with this channel for a while, you know that the moment when the translation catches up to the emotion is always the one that matters most. We are getting very close to that moment. Stay with us. The mark on her palm became impossible to ignore in the 5th week. It had always been there, a slightly raised pattern on her left palm, following the lines of her hand but not identical to them, a tracery that she had been told by the market's examining physician at age 8 was an unusual but not medically significant birthmark. She had accepted this explanation because she had no other. Explanation to offer, and because invisibility was the strategy. And drawing attention to her palm was not compatible with invisibility. She had kept it covered when possible. She had not touched the old text with her bare left hand, until she was old enough and careful enough to ensure no one would see what happened when she did. In the 5th week, the mark began to respond to the palace itself. Not just to the texts, to the stone of the building, to the grounds, to the air of the central. Territory in a way that made her hand glow faintly in the dark of the lower archive when she was alone. She had pressed it against the reading table in alarm the first time, and waited until the glow subsided. And then she had sat in the dark for a while, and done her breathing exercise, the one she used when things were more than she had framework for, and then she had gone back to reading. She told Kale on a Tuesday morning, not because she had planned to, but because he came to the archive. Earlier than usual, and found her holding her left hand under the reading table and looking at it with an expression she apparently had not managed to make invisible enough, because he said, before he had even fully sat down, "What is happening with your hand?" She put it on the table. She turned it palm up. The mark was visible in the lamplight as a slightly raised pattern. It was not glowing currently. It was simply there, as it had always been. The tracery that followed her palm lines, but was not identical to them. He looked at it for a very long time without speaking. "You knew," she said, for the second time since her arrival. "I suspected," he said, and his voice had something in it that she had not heard before. When the report mentioned the archivist who was teaching herself the old tongue, the specific texts she had found, the ones they listed, I recognized them. They were the texts most closely associated with the Ashvale documentation, the likelihood of someone unrelated to the bloodline finding those specific texts and being drawn to them was... He stopped, very low. "You came to see if I had the mark." "I came to bring you home," he said, and the word landed in the room with a weight and a warmth that she had not been prepared for, and that moved through her in a way she could not prevent, and did not entirely want to. She looked at her palm. She looked at him. "It has been responding to the palace," she said. "To the territory. It began in the 5th week. It is stronger when I am near the source document." "Can I see it?" he said. "When it is active." She thought about this. She thought about 23 years of covering the mark, and keeping her eyes down and her breathing even, and her hands busy, about the accumulated practice of not showing anyone anything that might constitute a reason for attention, about the way she had built invisibility into the architecture of herself so thoroughly that visible felt dangerous even when she was standing in front of someone who had brought her here precisely because of who she was. She reached out and pressed her palm against the cover of the source document. The glow came immediately. Not faint, not the dim answering warmth she had experienced in the Northern Archive. Strong and clear and golden, filling the lower archive with a light that was not lamplight, that moved differently than lamplight, that came from somewhere below the surface of her skin and illuminated the room the way the old texts described the primordial guardians illuminating the territory they were bound to, from the inside out, the land itself giving light through the person who carried its memory. She heard Kale's breath change. She kept her palm on the source document. She looked at him. He was looking at her hand, and then at her face, and the expression he wore was the most visible one she had seen on him in 5 weeks, stripped of the careful control he maintained in every other context, something that was not. Quite awe and not quite relief, and not quite the word she had been struggling to translate from the old tongue-binding contract, but was all three simultaneously. The same problem. No precise modern equivalent. "The contract," she said, keeping her voice steady. "The word I could not translate. The relationship it describes between the Guardian and the territory's alpha." "Yes," he said. "I have been thinking about it for 2 weeks. I do not think it translates into a single word." She paused. I think it means something like, the person who is chosen to know you completely, who is bound to you not by law or hierarchy, but by the specific fact of genuine recognition, who sees not what you present, but what you actually are. She stopped. The glow from her palm was warm and steady. Both directions, she said. The contract describes it as mutual. The silence was complete. That is, Cale said very carefully, a significant translation. It is an accurate one, she said. I have cross-referenced it 6 different ways. I know you have, he said, and the tone of it was something she had no prior experience of, directed at her. A tone that carried weight and warmth and the specific quality of being spoken by someone who had been paying attention for 5 weeks and had not looked away. She took her hand from the source document. The glow faded slowly, reluctantly, like the last light of something that had been waiting a very long time to shine. I think, she said, that we should discuss what this means, practically. Yes, he said, for the territory, for the bloodline documentation, for the council's historical record. Yes. I will need to continue the translations, the full archive. It will take several more months at minimum. You have as long as you need, he said. She looked at him. And then there is the other part. Yes, he said. For a 3rd time. And this time the word meant something else entirely, and they both knew it, and she held the knowing steady in the center of her attention, and found, to her own careful surprise, that she was not afraid of it. Something very old and very patient was waking up, and the waking felt, against all of her experience and all of her careful expectation, like coming home. If this story is speaking to something in you right now, please leave a comment. Tell us what you love about Lena. Tell us what you see in Kyle. Tell us what you are hoping for. This community is one of the most thoughtful we have ever encountered, and your responses genuinely shape the stories we bring to you. The council learned of Lena's presence in the palace in the 7th week. She had known it was coming. She had known it the way she knew most things that were coming, not through information she had been given, but through the pattern of smaller things that preceded it. The way the palace staff's behavior shifted fractionally in the days before. A new guardedness in the lower corridors. A change in the rhythm of official correspondence arriving at the palace gates, Doran's expression when he passed her in the hallway, becoming something more complex than his default careful neutrality. She had said nothing to Cale about these observations. She had simply noted them and continued her work and waited. When Kyle came to the lower archive on a Thursday evening and told her that 3 council representatives had requested an official audience to discuss a matter of territorial concern, she simply nodded and asked him when. Tomorrow morning, he said. Will I be present? He looked at her steadily. If you choose to be. She thought about this. She thought about the invisibility strategy and its limits, about 23 years of keeping her head down, and her mark covered, and her knowledge of the old tongue to herself, about the moment in the servant market when she had chosen, against her own calculus, to answer truthfully when he asked if she could read the language. She thought about what she had translated in the past 2 weeks, specifically the section of the source document that described the council action 280 years ago, the exact language used in the official decree, the internal contradictions in the stated justifications, the surviving testimony of the 3 guardian witnesses, who had not been silenced in time, and whose statements remained embedded in the source document in a subsection that the council had evidently not realized was there. I will be present, she said. The council representatives arrived at 10 in the morning, which was earlier than the scheduled audience time, a deliberate choice of the kind that powerful people made to establish a particular dynamic before proceedings began. Lena was already in the formal meeting room when they arrived, seated to Cale's left at the long table, with 3 texts in front of her, arranged in the cross-reference order she had developed. She had chosen her position carefully. She was not attempting to be invisible. There were 3 of them. Councillor Marin, who held the northern seat, and whose expression upon seeing Lena moved through several rapid revisions before settling on something carefully composed. Elder Silas, who was the oldest active council member and had been on the body for 40 years, who looked at her with an attention that told her he already knew more than Marin, and a younger man named Revek, whose official title was Territorial Affairs Liaison, and who she suspected was there primarily to take notes and report back to the full council body. Marin opened with pleasantries. She was practiced at pleasantries. She offered them with the fluency of someone who had used them for decades as a specific rhetorical instrument, a way of establishing a tone that made direct challenge feel socially inappropriate. Lena listened and made no pleasantries of her own, which she observed was noted by all 3 of them. Then Marin said, with careful warmth, "We understand your majesty has acquired a new member of the palace household, a servant with some specialized skills." She looked at Lena with an expression that was almost but not quite a smile. "We were hoping to understand more about the nature of her role here." "She is the palace archivist," Cale said. He said it with the same quiet certainty he used for everything. "She is translating the lower archive." A pause. "The lower archive," Elder Silas said, and his tone was different from Marin's. Stripped of the careful warmth, something older and less curated in it. "I was not aware the lower archive was accessible." "It is accessible to those with the relevant skills," Kyle said. Silas looked at Lena directly. "What has been translated so far?" She had been waiting for a direct question. She had prepared for several versions of it. She looked at Silas with the same even attention she gave to difficult texts and said, "I have completed translations of the first 47 texts in the collection, cross-referenced with external sources from the Northern Archive, and produced a preliminary documentary record of the primordial Guardian bloodline spanning 3 centuries of undocumented succession." The room changed. It was subtle. These were practiced people in positions that required them to manage their responses in high-stakes situations. But she had spent 23 years reading things that most people did not notice, and she read what happened in the room when she said, those words. Myron's breath altered. Revek's hand moved on his correspondence ledger in a way that was not the movement of ordinary note-taking, and Silas became very still in a way that was not calm, but its opposite. "That is," Marin said after a moment, "a significant undertaking." "It is an accurate one," Lena said, using the same words she had used with Cale, in the lamplight, with her palm glowing on the source document. "I have cross-referenced each finding 6 different ways. The Guardian bloodline, Silas said, was documented as extinct following natural causes 280 years ago. Yes, she said. I am aware of that documentation. I have also translated the source texts that predate the council action, including the 3 witness testimonies that were submitted to the body at the time of the decree, and that contain direct contradictions of the official stated justification. She reached out and placed her hand on the topmost text in front of her. The warmth came immediately, steady and certain, and she did not look at her palm. She kept her eyes on Silas. The Ashvale bloodline was not extinct. It was suppressed. The succession was maintained through a chain of undocumented descent that is now fully recoverable from the source materials. I am the last living heir. The silence that followed was a different species of silence from any she had produced in that room so far. Marin said, after a moment, "That is an extraordinary claim." "It is a documented one," she said. "The documentation is available for review by any party with sufficient expertise in the old tongue to verify the translations." She paused. "I am currently the only such party available, which I understand may create a verification challenge. I am open to suggestions for how to address that." It was Cale who spoke next, and what he said was simple and delivered in his quietest register, the one that carried farthest. "The documentation will be submitted to an independent review body composed of scholars without council affiliation. The process will be transparent, and the findings will be public record." He looked at Silas. "The question of what has been suppressed, and by whose authority, and what the current governing implications are, will be addressed in that process." Elder Silas looked at Lena for a long moment. She held his gaze. She had spent 23 years not meeting people's eyes. She was done with that. "The mark," he said finally. Very quietly. "Yes," she said, and turned her left palm upward on the table. She had not pressed it against the source document. She had simply placed it on the table, flat and open. And the mark was there, as it had always been, the tracery that followed her palm lines but was not identical to them. Under the light of the meeting room windows, it was visible as a raised pattern with a particular quality that she knew, from the source document's description, was unmistakable to anyone who knew. What they were looking for. Silas looked at it for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "We will need to recess." "Of course," Cale said. The 3 council representatives left the room. Through the closed door, Lena could hear the low, urgent sound of a conversation happening on the other side of it. She looked at her palm. She turned it face down on the table. "You did not tell me you were planning to do that," Cale said. "I made the decision this morning," she said. "And if it had gone differently, then I would have managed whatever came next," she said. "I have been managing things with inadequate resources for 23 years. I am fairly practiced." He was looking at her with the expression she could not fully name, the one that existed in the register below what most people would notice. "Yes," he said. "I know." And the way he said it told her that he had noticed, and that he had been noticing, and that the noticing had accumulated into something that neither of them had put into direct language, yet because the direct language required a kind of courage that even she, who had just placed her mark on the table in front of a council that had suppressed her bloodline for 2 centuries and 80 years, was still working her way toward. If you are watching this and you have ever had to fight for the right to be seen as who you actually are, please know this story was made for you. Share it with someone who needs it. And if you have not yet subscribed, now is an excellent moment. The review process took 4 months. Lena had expected it to take longer, or to be more contested, or both. She had prepared, with the careful thoroughness that was her default mode, for a sustained institutional resistance, for challenges to her translations, for attempts to locate alternative interpretations of the source documents, for the full bureaucratic repertoire of a system defending itself against inconvenient evidence. Some of that happened. The council commissioned their own linguistic consultants, 3 of them, all scholars of historical language with significant credentials, and all 3 of them spent 6 weeks in the lower archive, with access to the full collection, working with her translations and the original texts. She made herself available to all 3 of them for questions. She answered every question with complete precision, and provided every cross-reference they requested. She did not soften any translation, or suggest any alternative reading. That she did not believe to be equally valid. She was, in the estimation of all 3 consultants, as she later learned from the report they submitted to the review body, the most rigorous and methodologically sound translator of primordial texts currently available, operating with a command of the old-tongue rhetorical conventions that suggests a depth of study inconsistent with the circumstances of her prior employment. The review body submitted its findings in the 4th month. The findings. Confirmed. The systematic suppression of the Ashvale bloodline by council, decree 280 years prior. The fraudulent basis of the stated justification, the unbroken chain of succession documented in the Voss archive, and the identity of the last living heir. The council, faced with the public findings, had a choice. Lena had thought carefully about what choice they would make. She had concluded that Silas, specifically, would make the pragmatic calculation, rather than the resistant one, because he was old enough and experienced enough to recognize when a documented case had no viable counterposition, and when the cost of resistance exceeded the cost of acknowledgement. She had been right. The formal acknowledgement ceremony was held in the palace's main hall, before the assembled representatives of every territory in the central and northern regions, with the review body's findings read into official record, and the Ashvale name restored to the historical documentation from which it had been removed. Lena stood at the front of the room in a position she had never occupied before. Visible. Center. The subject of attention rather than its object. She wore the same kind of clothing she had always worn. She had not felt it was necessary to change that. She had her ink-stained hands at her sides and her dark eyes forward, and her breathing even, which was something she did by choice now rather than by the necessity of invisibility. Because it was simply who she was, and she was, increasingly, comfortable with who she was. Halfway through the reading of the formal acknowledgement, something happened in the room that she had not expected and had not prepared for. The 6 oldest members of the assembled pack representatives, the ones who carried the bloodlines that stretched back farthest in the territory's history, the ones whose families had been in the land longest and who had the deepest ancestral connection to what the territory itself remembered, those 6 people rose from their seats without apparent coordination, without any visible signal passing between them, and they turned to face her, and they bowed. Not the formal, shallow bow of social convention, the deep bow, the one the source document described as the proper acknowledgement of a guardian in the old tradition, the movement of a wolf who recognizes the person bound to the land they share. The room was very quiet. Lena stood very still. And then, from somewhere below, the floor, somewhere in the deep memory of the stone that the palace had been built from, she felt the territory respond. It moved through her palm, up her arm, through her chest, the warmth she had always known but never understood, and for the first time in 23 years, it was not a secret thing, not a covered and hidden and carefully invisible thing, but something that belonged where it was, in her, in this room, in this territory that had been waiting for her with the same patient. Accumulated endurance with which she had been waiting for herself. Her mark glowed. In the formal hall, in front of every assembled representative, in front of the council, in front of Kale, who was standing to her left at a distance that was not formal and was not the distance of a person who had purchased a servant for 1 coin. The mark on her left palm gave light, and the 6 wolves who had bowed were still bowing, and the territory itself was saying, through her skin, in the language that predated all other languages. Yes. Here. Finally. Home. She let it shine. That is the moment we have been building toward since the very first word of this story. If it moved something in you, please let us know in the comments. Tell us what you felt in that moment. This is a community of people who love these stories, and we want to hear from all of you. But we are not done. We are not done because the story of a woman being seen for who she is does not end in the moment of being seen. It continues into the life that is built after that moment. The choices that are made with full knowledge, rather than under the pressure of invisibility. The relationships that are allowed to grow in the open, rather than in the careful architecture of not showing. So stay with us. We have an epilogue to give you. 3 years after the acknowledgement ceremony, the lower archive was open. Not publicly, which would have required a level of access infrastructure the palace was still developing. But open to the scholars Lena had begun to train, 6 of them at present, all with varying degrees of old tongue familiarity, and all working under her supervision, learning the rhetorical convention she had reconstructed, building the reference lexicon she had begun. The work of full translation for the entire collection was estimated to take 15 years at the current pace, which she considered a reasonable estimate and a satisfying one, because it meant she had 15 years of work ahead of. Her that she was genuinely glad to be doing. The Ashvale name had been fully restored to the historical record. The council had been restructured, not dissolved, which had been the more radical option discussed in the public discourse following the acknowledgement, but restructured, with new representation requirements and a transparency protocol that Lena had spent several months helping to draft, because she had opinions about documentation standards and accountability systems, and had been invited to share them, which was still occasionally startling, but less so than it had been. Silas had retired. Marin had adapted, which Lena thought was probably what Marin had always been going to do in the end, because she was a pragmatist rather than a true believer. Ravik had turned out, unexpectedly, to have a genuine talent for the new transparency processes, and was now managing the public record system with an efficiency that Lena respected. The Guardian documentation had been formally established as an ongoing institutional role rather than a historical artifact. There were, as she continued to read through the archive, indications that other bloodline suppressions had occurred in the 280 years since the original council action, other names removed from other records, other people walking through the world carrying marks they did not understand, and knowledge they had not been given context for. She had submitted a formal proposal for a systematic review of all territorial historical records. The proposal had been approved. She had a great deal of work to do. On a Tuesday morning in early spring, 3 years and 4 months after arriving at the Voss palace in the carriage of an Alpha King, who had bought her for 1 coin, she was in the lower archive, translating a section of text she had been looking forward to for weeks. A passage about the early relationship between the first Ashvale Guardian and the first Voss Alpha, which the surrounding context suggested was going to be revealing in ways she was already anticipating, when the door opened and Cale came in. He did this. He came to the archive in the mornings now as well as the evenings, without particular reason or announcement, in the way that people came to places where someone they wanted to be near was present. She had made her peace with this. She had made more than her peace with it. She had, in the language of the old tongue-binding contract, which she had now translated, with full precision and complete confidence, understood what the word meant. The person who is chosen to know you completely, who sees not what you present, but what you actually are. Both directions. Mutual. He sat down in the chair beside her, the corner chair that he had moved to the desk position permanently approximately 8 months ago, and looked at what she was reading. "How is it?" he said. "Good," she said. "Better than I expected." The first Ashvale Guardian apparently had opinions about translation methodology. "Sounds familiar," he said. She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the text with a faint version of the expression she still could not fully name, and had stopped trying to, because it belonged to him specifically, and did not require a category other than itself. After 3 years, she knew it the way she knew her own mark. Not a mystery to be solved, but a known thing, recognizable, part of the landscape of her daily life. She turned her left hand over and placed it on the table between them, palm up. His hand came to rest over it, his palm against hers, warm and steady, the mark between them like a conversation they had been having since before either of them had language for it. Outside the archive, the palace moved through its morning routines. Beyond the palace walls, the Central Territory was conducting the ordinary business of a territory at peace, its records being corrected, its history being restored, its governance being held to a standard it had previously avoided. Beyond the territory's borders, a systematic review was underway that would eventually surface other names, other marks, other people who had been made invisible by the decisions of those who feared what full visibility would require. All of that was true, and ongoing, and she was responsible for a significant portion of it. And she was also here, in the lower archive, on a Tuesday morning in early spring, with the oldest texts in the territory around her and a scholar's life's work in front of her, and the warmth of the mark steady and unashamed in her palm, held by someone who had come to her for documents, and stayed because he had found something the documents had only described. She turned the page. She read. She was, for the first time in her life, and in the fullest sense of the word, exactly where she belonged. Thank you for being here for this entire journey. If Lena's story moved you, if the moment those ancient wolves bowed made you catch your breath. If you have ever known what it feels like to carry something important in a world that refuses to look at you, please leave a comment below and tell us. This channel exists because of you and for you, and we read everything you write. Please subscribe if you have not yet. Share this video with someone who needs a story about being found, and we will see you in the next one. We have more waiting for you. We always do.